Today, there was a big Russian terrorist attack about a couple hours ago. Near Moscow, there was a terrorist attack in a theater. About 40 people are dead, and Russia itself just confirmed 147 total victims. So this was obviously a massive deal. I mean, this is a big attack. One of the biggest in modern times for Russia. Obviously, everybody would think first, who is to blame in this, right? People would automatically assume Ukraine, obviously, because they're in a direct conflict with Russia. But these weren't Ukrainian affiliates or Ukrainian soldiers. ISIS has actually claimed responsibility for this. Russia has come out and through its senators, some senators have obviously openly claimed Ukraine was behind it. That was to be expected, obviously. The U.S. has hinted at possible Russian citizens or a Russian false flag. They said something like, not everybody in Russia likes Putin, which is kind of indirectly saying that this could be people inside of Russia's citizens doing this. That seems a bit odd to say this early. But I think it's important to look at it through the lens of who has the most to gain from something like this, and look at it also through the lens of past behaviors and tendencies. Look at it through the Russia lens, okay? Russia has given us no reason to think they would do this to their own citizens. I mean, the whole reason, whether you disagree with it or not, or whatever you think about Russia or its motives behind the Ukrainian conflict, their whole reasoning is, well, the main point for them was their own love for their own citizens, and they believed that there were citizens in Ukraine that were actually Russian. They identified as Russian, they spoke Russian, they had Russian cultures, they loved Russia, and it was sort of a taking back our own people sort of stance. And you know, when a country has motives like that, loves its own citizens that much, to do something like that, to launch an attack on its own citizens seems a bit contradictory. Doesn't really make sense. Also, Putin just won an election in a massive landslide. He won 88% of the votes, so there's no reason for him to try to prolong the Ukrainian war to stay in power or launch a bigger conflict for political reasons. It wouldn't really make sense for him to do that. I mean, he's been extremely de-escalatory. He used the interview with Tucker Carlson to sort of promote a negotiation, a peace deal, something to put an end to the conflict. And Tucker actually said that off camera, he alluded to him that he wants a peace negotiation to begin. He wants to come to terms. That's part of the reason everybody kind of wondered why he didn't openly bury the West for its support of Ukraine. And it appears the reason was he wants negotiations. He doesn't want to go backwards rhetoric-wise, unlike the U.S., to come to a deal, to come to the negotiation table. So those are just a few of the reasons why it really does not make sense for Russia to do this to its own citizens. I don't see what there is to gain from this. Russia has openly been willing to put an end to, or saying they're willing to come to terms. So prolonging an attack, to have a false flag and pin it on the Ukrainians instead of pushing the peace narrative like they have, it doesn't really make any sense to do that. And you look, Putin has had many valid. He wouldn't be really blamed by a lot of people for launching a wider conflict with the U.S. and NATO. We've given him many reasons to push the conflict to us. I mean, first of all, the continuation of aid to Ukraine and supporting Ukraine against Russia, also using or giving Ukraine our own weapons to launch attacks against Russia. There's also reports, and Putin alluded this himself in the Tucker Carlson interview, that he believes that there are U.S. special forces and officials in Ukraine, maybe not directly fighting, I mean, possibly, I wouldn't be surprised, but at least aiding Ukraine actually in the battlefield. So that alone is a massive reason to launch a bigger conflict. Again, I'm not supporting this. I do not want a world war, obviously. So I'm very glad that Putin hasn't. But if you look at it, he's had many reasons through Russia's lenses to launch a wider conflict. So he's continued to have restraint. Thank God he hasn't launched a world conflict, because that's what it would turn into. I mean, the Russia versus NATO conflict would turn into China and Russia versus the U.S. Obviously, Russia versus NATO, North Korea, Iran, and all their allies would come in. I mean, it would start a massive fire globally. And Putin has constantly said he doesn't want that, and his actions back that up. So it doesn't make sense for it to be Russia to launch a false flag like this, and then for ISIS to claim respect. It doesn't really make sense through the Russia lens. You look at it through the Ukraine and the U.S. lens. I kind of merge them together, obviously, because they're fighting this war against Russia together pretty much. They have a much higher logical motive. Possibly trying to probe Russia into a wider conflict, I think, is going to be the main reason that people think Ukraine and the U.S. was behind this. I mean, it makes sense, right? If you look, the people who are getting rich off this war in Ukraine, I talked about this last episode, the military-industrial complex, they are getting extremely rich off this war, and they are bloodthirsty. I mean, they constantly want conflict. And we have, for some reason, we still have this massive grudge with Russia. It's like we haven't left the Cold War. So our continued despite and our continued hatred of Russia, I believe there's a lot of people in Congress, or in the shadow government, I like to call it, the people who are making decisions behind closed doors that aren't in the public eye. I mean, look at Lindsey Graham. He uses every chance he can. Any instance that happens, he loves to use it to claim that we need to be directly fighting Russia. I mean, there was that one clip where he was talking to Zelensky and he was like, when Russians are dying, it's a good thing. That is crazy to say publicly. I mean, to say that against another global superpower is insane. So they've given us, the U.S. politicians have given us many reasons to think that they want a direct conflict with Russia. I mean, if they didn't, they would put an end to this Ukraine conflict. They would come to peace terms with Russia, and they would stop obsessing over having Ukraine and NATO, having weapons right on Russia's border, having access to Ukraine to put possibly our own weapons on Russia's border. But if they're a NATO ally, we certainly are within our rights to do that. So if you look at it that way, the U.S. alone has more of a logical motive to somehow stage this, get this a horrendous attack to take place. Obviously, they won't be stupid enough to do it directly with Ukrainian soldiers. They would probably do it through somebody else like ISIS or anybody. I mean, it's the whole thing is just really fishy, okay? How many ISIS or terrorist attacks have there been in Russia lately at all? Like, this is not a common thing for Islamic terrorists to launch attacks like this in Russia. I mean, Russia has had a anti-terrorist push, a really strong one, to keep this stuff at bay to where it doesn't happen. There's not really a big Islamic terrorist setting in Russia in general. So it's extremely odd for it to be ISIS, which makes you think somebody is probably using them to push an agenda. And I really think, obviously, the Russians know who's behind. I mean, with Russian intelligence, I wouldn't be surprised if they already know who's behind it and are already conducting plans to respond. I mean, Russia never goes the emotional route. Let's just start bombing people. Let's start, using tactical nukes or whatever. They're more surgical, quiet, but deliberate and ruthless. And they will get to who did this, and they will do what is necessary and nothing beyond that. So don't put it. I mean, the U.S. does this all the time. They use other proxies, other people to push their own narratives. I mean, look at Ukraine. Ukraine is a perfect example of that. There's many other examples of, I mean, look at the Bay of Pigs, right? We love to get inside and get people to do our own jobs for us without us directly doing it. I would not be surprised if this was another reason for that. I mean, the U.S. has used ISIS to do its own agendas in the Middle East before. So I wouldn't put it past it for the U.S. to do something like this, to use a group like ISIS to launch an attack like this. So another thing that's really fishy about this, the U.S. gave advance notice with eerily accurate descriptions of possible sites for a terrorist attack. They advised U.S. citizens in Russia to stay away from theaters, concerts, malls, public settings for 48 hours. That was about 2 weeks ago, I think it was. And where did this attack take place? In a theater, in a mall. That's very fishy and eerily accurate, right? So, why would the U.S. do that? Okay, let's say a hypothetical, the United States was behind this attack, okay, through ISIS. Why would they give advance notice? To try to cover its tracks, I would assume. But to do what they're doing right now with Russia, to say, hey, we warned you. Well, you guys didn't want to listen to us, which is really messed up to do. These are Russian citizens. And it wasn't even a notice to Russians. It was to U.S. citizens in Russia. So they're going the route of, we warned you, sorry. And then saying, we know not everybody in Russia likes Putin. It seems like a very specific, deliberate response, a strategic response. And that makes me more suspicious. I mean, this just happened hours ago. I believe more is going to come out behind this. Obviously, ISIS has already come out and claimed responsibility, right? So, right now, there's no reason to believe that the Russians were behind this. And there's really only two more options. And they're kind of merged into one, the U.S. and Ukraine. And I think the most logical point at first is to try to bait Russia into a wider conflict. So, obviously, this is fresh and raw, like I said. More is going to come out. There's going to be a lot of theories about this. But I would urge you to look at it through your own lens. Don't listen to what the prepared responses are from, like, the U.S. Look through it through your own lens of, okay, who would gain the most from something like this? Who has the highest motive to do something like this? And like I said, I really find it hard to believe Russia would do this to their own citizens, especially through ISIS of all groups. I mean, that's just very, I don't see that adding up. So I don't expect the Russians to have a very emotional response. I mean, if they did, they would probably already start launching tactical nukes at Ukraine, and there would already be a massive response militarily. We don't have that yet. The Russians are going to do this very deliberately, smartly, strategically, and deliberate response. Handle the problem, do it what's necessary, nothing more, nothing less. That's what they've done throughout that's what they've always done throughout history, right? So I'm not going down the World War III path with this, obviously. I mean, we'll see. I don't think the Russians are going to push this further and have a bigger response than what's needed. So horrendous attack. I mean, this is one of the biggest terrorist attacks in Russian history. I mean, you got 40 dead, 147 injured. That's a very big response. And there's some very gruesome videos out already of the attacks. So it's horrible. It's horrible.